Imagine a tall, narrow room somewhere in Florence, or perhaps Venice, or perhaps a smaller hill town whose name history has mostly forgotten. It's evening, 500 years ago, give or take a few decades. Outside, the last church bell of the day has already rung, and the streets below have gone quiet the way Italian streets do once the heat finally breaks and supper has been eaten. But here, up a narrow staircase behind a heavy wooden door, a single room still holds its light. Candles burn low and steady along a long reading desk. The air smells of leather, of dust, of old paper and older ink, and beneath all of it, very faintly, of the beeswax used to seal certain bindings against the damp. This is a library. Not the vast public reading rooms you might picture from a much later century, but something smaller, quieter, more private. A scholar's study, perhaps, or the personal collection of a wealthy merchant family. Its shelves lined with manuscripts copied by hand and, increasingly in this particular slice of history, with something newer still. Printed books, their pages produced not by a single tired scribe's hand but by a press. Movable type pressed again and again onto paper, multiplying words in a way that would have seemed like sorcery only a century before. Tonight, we're going to sit in this room together. We'll turn pages slowly, the way a careful reader turns them, and we'll learn what it actually felt like to spend a quiet evening surrounded by books in an age when books themselves were still, in a very real sense, a kind of miracle, expensive, treasured, protected, and read by candlelight with a reverence we've mostly lost today. So let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow to match the soft, steady rhythm of a page turning, and let's step together into the hush of a Renaissance library at the very end of a long day. Let's begin with the room, because a Renaissance library, whether grand or modest, was built with real intention, and understanding its shape tells you a great deal about how the people who used it actually thought and worked within it. Light mattered above all else. Books were expensive, difficult to replace, and reading by poor light was both uncomfortable and, over years of habit, genuinely damaging to the eyes. So wherever possible, a library room was positioned to catch good natural daylight through the hours it was most needed. Tall windows set high enough to avoid the damp and dust of the street below, sometimes fitted with glass, itself still a costly luxury in this period, sometimes simply left as shuttered openings closed against rain and cold. Once the sun had gone down, candlelight took over, and a serious reader understood candles the way we understand batteries today, a finite, carefully managed resource. Beeswax candles burning cleaner and brighter than the cheaper tallow variety, but costing considerably more, so a scholar working late into the evening made real, practical choices about exactly how much of that expensive light they were willing to burn for one more hour of reading. The furniture of the room reflected the books themselves. Many libraries of this period, particularly earlier in the Renaissance before printing had fully taken hold, used lectern-style desks, sloped reading surfaces to which the largest and most valuable volumes were sometimes physically chained, a practice that sounds almost comically restrictive to modern ears, but made real, practical sense given how costly and how easily lost or stolen a single manuscript could be. A chained book could still be read, turned, consulted at length, but it could not simply walk out the door in someone's coat, and libraries that held their books this way, arranged along a row of slanted desks with chains running to a central rod, allowed a surprising number of readers to work in the same room at once, each anchored to their own small patch of desk and their own borrowed volume. Shelving, where books were not chained, tended towards simple, sturdy wooden cases, sometimes built directly into the walls, sometimes freestanding, and the books themselves were very often shelved spine inward in earlier practice, their titles written along the foredge of the pages rather than the spine, meaning a reader searching for a particular volume might need to pull several candidates partway out and check the edge of each before finding the right one. A small, patient ritual of searching that modern library browsing, with titles printed neatly along a visible spine, has almost entirely erased from memory. Before we go further into this particular evening, it's worth pausing to understand just how recent and how genuinely revolutionary the book itself, in the form we'd recognize it, actually was to the people sitting in this room. For most of the ancient world, texts had been kept on scrolls, long continuous rolls of papyrus or parchment, unrolled with one hand while re-rolled with the other, a format that made reading straightforward, but made searching for a specific passage genuinely difficult, since there was no way to simply flip open to a remembered page. The codex, the bound page format we now consider simply what a book is, emerged gradually in the early centuries of the Common Era, and had, by the time of the Renaissance, been the dominant format for well over 1,000 years, its pages sewn together at the spine and protected by wooden or leather covers, sometimes further reinforced with metal clasps or corner pieces to guard against the warping and swelling that damp Italian air could work on parchment and paper alike over the decades a well-cared-for book might survive. For nearly all of that 1,000 years, though, every single copy of every single text had been produced by hand, one scribe, one pen, one page at a time, an enormously slow, skilled and expensive process that meant even a modestly sized private library represented years, sometimes generations, of accumulated labour and expense. Monastic scriptoria across medieval Europe had carried much of this burden, monks copying religious texts and gradually classical ones as well, in careful, disciplined silence through long hours of daily labour, and the Renaissance humanists whose studies fill the room we're sitting in tonight owed an enormous, often under-acknowledged debt to exactly this patient monastic tradition, since it was very often a monastery's careful preservation of an ancient text, copied and recopied across centuries, that allowed a Renaissance scholar to rediscover it at all. And then, in the middle of the 15th century, everything changed with remarkable speed. The development of movable type printing, most famously associated with Johannes Gutenberg working in the German city of Mainz, spread across Europe with an almost startling velocity for a pre-industrial technology, reaching Italy within just a couple of decades and taking particularly deep root in Venice, which would become, by the century's end, one of the great printing centres of the entire European world. Suddenly, a text that had once required a scribe's entire year to copy by hand could be reproduced in the hundreds within a matter of weeks, and the room we're sitting in tonight, depending on exactly which decade of the Renaissance we've chosen to visit, might hold a careful mixture of both worlds side by side. Older manuscripts, copied by hand, their pages sometimes richly illuminated with painted decoration and gold leaf, standing on the very same shelf as newer printed volumes, their type crisp and uniform, considerably cheaper, but, to many readers of the era, carrying a certain unfamiliar plainness that the handwritten page had never quite had. Let's turn our attention now to the person actually sitting at that reading desk this evening, because their relationship to reading and to the books themselves was shaped by an entire intellectual culture that had grown up rapidly across Italy through the preceding century, a movement historians would later call humanism. Renaissance humanism placed enormous, almost devotional value on the recovery, careful study and imitation of classical antiquity, the literature, rhetoric, history and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome, texts that had, in many cases, survived only in scattered, incomplete or poorly copied forms through the medieval centuries and were now being actively sought out, compared against one another, corrected and translated afresh by scholars determined to recover as pure and accurate a version of the ancient world's wisdom as they possibly could. A scholar working in this room tonight might well be doing exactly this kind of comparative textual work, several different copies of the same ancient author spread across the desk at once, checking one manuscript's reading of a difficult passage against another's, making careful marginal notes in a small, precise hand, building, page by patient page, toward a better, more reliable text than any single surviving copy alone could offer. This was genuinely painstaking, genuinely absorbing work, and it required real physical stamina as well as intellectual discipline. Sitting for long hours at a reading desk in a chilly stone room, even in Italy's relatively mild climate, meant dressing warmly, a heavy woolen robe or gown worn specifically for study, sometimes fur-lined for the coldest months, and keeping a small brazier or portable heater nearby if the household could afford one, since numb fingers made for poor penmanship and a distracted mind. Ink had to be mixed and managed carefully, kept from freezing in the coldest months, kept from drying out and clogging a pen's careful cut nib in the driest. Quills required regular trimming and recutting as they wore down through use, a small practiced skill every serious reader and writer of the period possessed, sharpening a fresh point with a small, specifically designed knife whenever the previous one grew too blunt or too split to produce a clean, legible line. And there was the sheer, quiet pleasure of the work itself, which surviving letters and diaries from prominent humanist scholars describe again and again with genuine warmth and enthusiasm. A newly acquired manuscript tracked down after months or even years of careful searching and correspondence with booksellers and fellow scholars across several cities, arriving finally at a scholar's own desk, was treated with something close to genuine excitement, unwrapped carefully, examined first for its physical condition, its script, its apparent age and origin, before the real work of reading and comparing even properly began. This was not, for the people who practiced it, dry academic labour undertaken out of mere duty. It was, for many of its most devoted practitioners, one of the deepest and most genuine pleasures available to them, a quiet evening spent in what felt, quite literally, like conversation with the great minds of a distant and much admired past. Not every library in Renaissance Italy belonged to an individual working scholar, and it's worth spending some time tonight with the grander, more institutional libraries that great families and city governments built during this same period, because they tell us something important about how books themselves had come to be understood, not merely as tools for study, but as genuine symbols of prestige, power, and civic pride. The Medici family of Florence stands as perhaps the most famous example of this broader pattern. Their accumulated library, built up across several generations of careful, deliberate collecting, eventually forming the core of what would become one of Europe's great institutional collections, its manuscripts sought out through agents dispatched specifically to search monasteries and private collections across Italy, Greece, and further afield for texts believed lost or nearly so. A great family's library, displayed and made available, at least to some degree, to visiting scholars and honoured guests, functioned as a genuine statement of cultural authority, proof that a family's wealth had been turned not merely toward luxury and display in the more obvious sense, fine clothing, grand architecture, elaborate feasts, but toward the deeper, more lasting prestige of learning and patronage itself. This patronage extended crucially to the scribes, scholars, and eventually printers who did the actual work of producing and preserving these collections. Wealthy patrons commissioned beautifully illuminated manuscripts from skilled scribes and artists, paying handsomely for a single exquisitely produced copy of a text that might otherwise have circulated only in far plainer form. Gold leaf applied with real skill to decorate initial letters and borders, fine vellum selected and prepared with particular care, bindings tooled in leather and sometimes set with precious materials for the most treasured volumes of all. A scholar working in one of these grander patron-funded libraries operated within a genuinely different social world than the more modest private study we visited earlier this evening, surrounded by an explicit visible display of wealth and cultural ambition that the books themselves were meant, quite deliberately, to project outward toward anyone privileged enough to be shown inside. And yet for all this display, the actual daily texture of reading and study within even these grander rooms remained remarkably similar to what we've already described. The same careful management of candlelight, the same practiced skill in trimming a pen, the same quiet, absorbed hours spent bent over a difficult passage, working slowly toward understanding. Wealth changed the surroundings considerably. It changed the quality and quantity of what a scholar had access to, but it did not in any fundamental sense change what the actual experience of a quiet evening's reading felt like from the inside. Let's pause here to appreciate for a while the extraordinary amount of skilled craft that stood behind every single page in the room around us tonight, because a Renaissance reader, unlike most of us today, understood books as physical objects with a genuinely complicated, labour-intensive history behind their production, a history that shaped how carefully those books were handled and how deeply they were valued. Paper itself, though gradually displacing the older, more expensive parchment across this period, remained a genuinely skilled and labour-intensive product, made from linen and cotton rags, pulped, pressed into thin sheets on a wire mould, and carefully dried, a craft that had spread into Italy from the Islamic world several centuries earlier, and had, by the time of our evening tonight, developed into a substantial regional industry, particularly in and around certain towns that would become genuinely famous across Europe for the quality of their paper. Parchment, made from carefully prepared and stretched animal skin, most often calf, sheep, or goat, remained the material of choice for the most treasured and most formal manuscripts, even as paper grew more common for everyday use, its smooth, durable surface holding ink and illumination with a richness paper could rarely match, though at a cost that kept it reserved, increasingly, for a book's most important pages or most prestigious commissions. Ink, too, carried its own careful craft tradition, most commonly produced during this period from a mixture of gall nuts, small growths formed on oak trees in response to certain insect activity, combined with iron salts, gum, and water, producing a dark, durable ink that oxidized and darkened further as it dried and aged on the page, a chemical property scholars of the period understood well enough, even without our modern vocabulary for it, to work with confidently and predictably. Different regions and different workshops developed their own particular ink recipes and reputations, and a scholar particular about his materials might well have opinions, based on real experience, about which local source produced the most reliable, longest-lasting result. Binding, the final stage that transformed a stack of individual written or printed sheets into an actual usable book, involved its own distinct guild of skilled craftsmen, sewing gathered sheets together at the spine, attaching wooden or heavy pasteboard covers, and finishing the whole with leather, sometimes tooled with decorative patterns pressed into the surface using heated metal stamps, sometimes further reinforced with metal corner pieces and clasps to keep the pages pressed tightly closed against humidity and warping, an essential practical concern in a climate where damp could genuinely ruin an improperly stored volume within a matter of years. Every single book in the room around us tonight, whether grand illuminated manuscript or plainer printed volume, represented this same long chain of skilled hands, papermaker or parchmenter, scribe or printer, illuminator where relevant, and finally binder, each contributing their own careful expertise before a single page was ever turned by the reader, now sitting quietly at the desk. Let's slow down further still, and simply sit for a while in the sensory texture of this particular room, because there's a real, gentle pleasure in noticing exactly what an evening like this one would have actually sounded and smelled and felt like, the small physical details that made up the whole quiet experience of reading here. The dominant smell, layered and complex, came from the materials themselves. Old parchment carries a distinct, faintly animal scent, warm and slightly sweet, quite different from the sharper, more mineral smell of newer paper. Leather bindings, oiled and cared for to keep them supple against the dry, cracking damage age could otherwise inflict, added their own rich note. Beeswax from the candles contributed a faint honeyed warmth to the air, especially noticeable as a taper burned low and its flame drew closer to the last inch of wax. And beneath all of this sat the simple, mineral smell of ink itself, and of the stone walls and floor that made up so much of the room's actual physical structure, cool and slightly damp even in the height of an Italian summer. Sound in a room like this tended toward the extremely quiet, and this quiet was itself understood and cultivated with real deliberateness. The soft scratch of a pen nib against paper as marginal notes were added, the gentle rustle of a page being turned, parchment producing a distinctly crisper, slightly stiffer sound than the softer, more pliable paper increasingly common by this period. A candle's occasional soft crackle and hiss as its wick guttered briefly before steadying again. And, filtering faintly from outside through a shuttered or glazed window, the distant muffled sounds of the city beyond, a dog barking somewhere down the street, the far-off call of a night watchman marking the hour, the occasional soft clatter of cartwheels on cobblestone from some late traveller still making their way home. This particular combination of near silence, punctuated only by these small, soft, familiar sounds, produced a genuinely distinct atmosphere, one that surviving accounts from the period describe with real fondness, scholars writing to friends and colleagues about the particular pleasure of a quiet evening's study, the mind settling gradually into deeper and deeper focus the longer the surrounding hush continued undisturbed. It is, in its own way, remarkably close to exactly the kind of atmosphere you might be settling into yourself right now, listening to this story, the world outside gone quiet, your own attention gradually softening and slowing towards sleep. Just as we've discussed in earlier evenings together, how a medieval household protected its threshold with salt and iron, or how an Egyptian family protected its sleeping child with amulets and careful prayer. A Renaissance library carried its own distinct set of protective concerns, though these concerns, fittingly for a room built around books rather than bodies, focused above all on protecting the collection itself from the many genuine dangers threatening to destroy it. Fire represented the single greatest and most constantly feared danger to any library of this period, and reasonably so, since a room filled with dried parchment, paper, wood, and leather, lit each evening by open candle flame was, in the most literal practical sense, an extraordinarily flammable environment. Careful households and institutions alike developed real, disciplined habits around candle management specifically because of this risk. Candles kept in sturdy holders positioned well clear of any hanging drapery or loose papers, never left unattended for long stretches, and extinguished with real, deliberate care at the close of an evening's reading rather than simply left to burn down and gutter out on their own. Some grander libraries employed a dedicated attendant whose duties included exactly this kind of careful, nightly fire safety check, moving through the room after readers had departed to confirm every candle was properly extinguished and no stray ember remained smouldering anywhere among the shelves. Damp and humidity posed an equally serious, if less dramatic, threat, capable of warping bindings, staining pages, and encouraging the growth of mould that could, left unchecked, quietly destroy a valuable manuscript over the course of just a few damp seasons. Libraries were positioned and ventilated with this danger specifically in mind where possible, and books themselves were periodically taken down, opened and aired, a maintenance ritual that fell to whichever household member, servant or dedicated librarian held responsibility for the collection's ongoing care, checking each volume for early signs of trouble and addressing them before a small, manageable problem became a genuinely destructive one. And there was, of course, the simpler, more everyday concern of theft and simple carelessness, which is precisely why chaining valuable volumes to their reading desks remained common practice for the collection's most treasured and most difficult to replace pieces, and why access to a grander private or institutional library was very often carefully controlled, granted to trusted scholars and honoured guests rather than left freely open to anyone who happened to wander in off the street. A library, in short, required its own quiet, ongoing, careful stewardship, not so very different in spirit, however different in its specific methods, from the patient nightly maintenance a medieval family once brought to their own hearth and threshold. Let's lift our eyes for a moment from the desk and the page and consider what was happening in the wider world just beyond this particular room's shuttered windows, because the Renaissance library we've spent this evening sitting in existed within a period of genuinely extraordinary intellectual and cultural change, and it's worth understanding just how alive and how significant this particular moment in history actually felt to the people living through it. Italy in this period was not a single unified nation, but a patchwork of independent city-states, republics, and principalities. Florence, Venice, Milan, Rome, and many smaller centres. Besides, each developing its own particular flavour of Renaissance culture, its own patron families, its own artists and scholars, often in genuine, sometimes fierce competition with one another for prestige and influence. This political fragmentation, whatever its real costs and dangers, produced a genuinely rich diversity of intellectual centres, each drawing scholars, artists, and craftsmen from across the peninsula, and, increasingly, from further afield as the century wore on, ideas and manuscripts and artistic techniques moving between these centres along trade routes and personal correspondence networks that connected the room we're sitting in tonight to a genuinely vast, interconnected world of learning. Art and scholarship in this period were understood as far more closely intertwined than we might assume today, and a scholar's evening reading might well connect directly to a painter's or sculptor's own current commission, classical texts on proportion, perspective, and the natural world studied specifically to inform new artistic techniques being developed and refined in workshops across the city. Science, too, in the looser, broader sense the period understood it, natural philosophy, medicine, astronomy, was pursued through exactly this same careful study of both classical texts and, increasingly as the century progressed, direct observation and experiment, a gradual still forming shift in method that would, over the following century, blossom into what we now call the scientific revolution. And running beneath all of this specific intellectual activity sat a broader, genuinely felt cultural conviction, expressed again and again in the letters and writings of the period's most prominent humanist scholars, that they were living through a genuine rebirth, a conscious, deliberate recovery and renewal of the wisdom and achievement of a classical world they believed had been partially lost or obscured through what they characterized, not always fairly, as the intervening medieval centuries. This sense of participating in something genuinely significant, a deliberate collective project of cultural renewal, gave the quiet, solitary work of an evening's reading real weight and real purpose beyond simple personal pleasure or professional obligation, and it's worth carrying that sense of quiet, purposeful significance with you now, as our own evening in this room draws gently toward its close. Let's return, one final time, to the scholar at the reading desk, because the evening, however absorbing, cannot continue forever, and there's a particular, gentle pleasure in watching exactly how a night of careful study drew itself to its own natural close. As the hour grows late, the candles have burned considerably lower, their light growing softer, warmer, and slightly less steady, as the wicks lengthen and require every so often a careful trim with a small pair of snuffers kept close at hand for exactly this purpose. The scholar's own attention, sharp and focused through the earlier hours of the evening, begins to soften too. The fine, careful comparison of one manuscript's reading against another's growing gradually harder to sustain with full precision, a clear signal understood and respected by nearly every serious reader of the period, that the evening's productive work has, for tonight at least, reached its natural end. Books are closed carefully, their pages settled evenly before the cover comes down. Any loose bookmark, very often a simple strip of parchment or cloth, tucked securely into place to mark exactly where tomorrow's reading should resume. Ink pots are sealed against the overnight air, which could otherwise dry and ruin their contents by morning. Pens are wiped clean and set aside, and the candles themselves, one by one, are carefully pinched or snuffed out. The small, familiar ritual of closing down the room for the night, plunging it gradually into a deeper and deeper darkness as each remaining flame is extinguished in turn. The scholar rises, joints stiff from long hours of stillness, and makes their way, perhaps by the light of a single small lamp carried for exactly this purpose, out of the library and toward whatever bed awaits them elsewhere in the house. Behind them, the room settles into its own long, quiet overnight stillness. Shelves of patiently gathered books, some centuries old already, some barely off the press, resting together in the dark, waiting, unbothered, for tomorrow evening's candlelight and tomorrow's careful, patient hands to return and take up exactly where tonight's reading left off. Before we let this particular evening close, it's worth spending a little time on a part of this story that surviving records handle far more sparingly than we might like, but which deserves real attention nonetheless. The presence, often quieter and more constrained, but genuinely real, of women within this same world of Renaissance reading and learning. Formal education and access to the grandest libraries and most prestigious scholarly circles remained overwhelmingly restricted to men across nearly the entire span of the Italian Renaissance, a reflection of the period's broader social structure, rather than any absence of genuine female interest or capability. And yet, particularly among wealthy and noble families, daughters were sometimes given a genuinely serious education, tutored in Latin, sometimes Greek, and exposed to exactly the same classical texts occupying the shelves of the room we've spent this evening in. And a small but genuinely remarkable number of women emerged from these circumstances as recognized scholars and writers in their own right, corresponding with prominent humanist figures, producing translations and original works that earned real, if often qualified, respect from their male contemporaries. Convents too played a quietly significant role in preserving and extending women's access to reading and learning throughout this period, continuing a tradition stretching back through the medieval centuries of nuns maintaining their own libraries, copying and occasionally composing texts, and pursuing forms of scholarly and devotional study that, within the walls of a religious community, faced somewhat fewer of the social constraints that governed a woman's life outside them. A convent library, quieter still and more modest than the grand collections of Florence's wealthiest families, nonetheless carried forward exactly the same careful, patient culture of reading, copying and preservation. We've spent this whole evening exploring, candles managed with the same careful economy, pages turned with the same quiet reverence, evenings closed down with the same familiar ritual of snuffed wicks and carefully shelved volumes. It would be dishonest to suggest this access was ever equal, or that the wider intellectual culture of the Renaissance did not carry real, significant limitations for the women who nonetheless found their way into it. But it would be equally dishonest to leave them out of this story entirely, because in rooms not so very different from the one we've spent tonight in, by candlelight not so very different from the light we've been sitting beside, a smaller, quieter, often less recorded circle of women were turning exactly the same kinds of pages, working through exactly the same kinds of difficult passages, and finding, in their own way, exactly the same quiet, absorbing pleasure in a long evening spent among old and treasured books. So let the last candle in that Renaissance library burn down all the way now, its small flame finally guttering out into a thin curl of fragrant smoke, the room settling into full, complete darkness around the shelves and the chained desks and the carefully closed books resting quietly on their stands. Let the sounds of the city outside fade further still, the last cartwheel, the last distant dog, the last far-off call of the night watchman marking an hour that no longer needs marking, since everyone who needed to hear it has already found their way home. You don't need to finish your own reading tonight. Whatever page you were on, whatever passage you were halfway through, it will be exactly where you left it, waiting patiently. The way every good book waits for whenever you're ready to return to it. The room is dark now, and safe, and quiet, and nothing in it requires your attention any further tonight. If this quiet evening among old books and low candlelight helped carry you towards sleep, you're welcome to leave a gentle tap of a thumb before your own eyes closed the rest of the way, and let us know in the comments which quiet corner of history you'd like us to visit next. And if you'd like to keep returning to evenings like this one, consider following the show so the next candle is already lit and waiting for you whenever you're ready to sit back down at the desk. For now, though, none of that needs to happen yet. There is only the dark, settled hush of an old library at the end of a long evening, and the deep, patient comfort of knowing that everything within it, every page, every carefully bound volume, every quiet hour of thought it holds, will still be there, exactly as you left it, when morning finally comes. Rest now. The books can wait until morning. They always have.